All right, we are live. Welcome, everyone. And I see a few folks already tuned in online. And so, welcome to another installation, another episode of the Streamlit show where we kind of talk about everything Streamlit and what's going on in the ecosystem of AI space. And today I'm joined by Zain Hoda. He's the CTO of Vanna. Welcome, Zain.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk to you about some really cool topics today. And I think most people in the data space will be really interested in what we have to share today. And for folks watching us, just want to be able to reiterate that throughout this entire show today, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. If you're on LinkedIn, just type it under where you're watching, and we'll be able to get them here. And we'll be able to address these questions at the end of the event. So please fill us with your questions. We will really appreciate and glad to answer them. And so, just to get started, let's first dive into your background. Who is Zain? And I've kind of done some digging a bit about your background, and you've spent a lot of time in the finance space, especially in the investment banking space, for most of your career. And you've worked at some really cool companies: BlackRock, Bloomberg, BNY Mellon, and you've also had a startup more dealing with alternative data space, and now you're the CTO and co-founder of Vanna AI. That seems to be a very interesting journey there, and also to note, we kind of worked at the same company at some point, probably different times, Bloomberg. So that's pretty cool. And I just want to understand a bit more about um, how did you make the pivot to the startup scene, and also what was kind of the motivation for you to start Vanna?
Yeah, as you said, so I spent most of my initial career in finance. I do have a background in computer science. I did my undergrad in computer science, and then I did a master's degree in finance. Working in finance, particularly in the quantitative space, I initially had the idea for how can we bring quantitative tools to
Mm,
fundamental investors.
yeah.
So in finance, quants have these very sophisticated tools for analyzing data, in particular analyzing large amounts of data, but those tools were difficult or inaccessible to fundamental investors. And so that's where I started my first company, Alpha Hat, and that was the premise where we were trying to bring the same types of tools that quantitative investors have to some of the more fundamental oriented investors. And through that process, we realized that one of the things that they really wanted to analyze was alternative data. So
Okay.
alternative data in the finance realm is basically data that doesn't come from the company. So it's not like financial statements. It's not stock prices. It's like data like credit card data, transaction data. And what we were using was mobile geolocation data to get a feel for what was going on with, generally speaking, retail consumer brands, and trying to analyze, for example, you can use mobile geolocation data as a proxy for foot traffic and get some sense of like trends for how that grows or shrinks over time, and analysis on specific regions. Um, so I sold that company to Earnest Research, which is an alternative data provider that has some of these additional data sets like credit card data and whatnot. And then, as LLMs started becoming more and more prevalent, I started thinking about how could we use LLMs as part of the data analysis process. And I think, particularly for problems that we see in the alternative data space,
Yeah.
it's kind of similar in the sense of, so if you are giving alternative data to an end user, whether they're an investor or whatever, basically you can present it to them in a dashboard, and the dashboard will be able to answer typically a fixed set of questions. And you set those up as drop downs and things like that. But anytime that the end user has an ad hoc question that they need answered, then you're essentially the only alternative is you have to give them raw access to the data, deliver them the data, and then you have additional problems of, that end user needs to know like SQL, they need to know the structure of the database, how to query it, and that sort of thing. And so that's where I started thinking about, um, how we could leverage LLMs to kind of bridge that gap, particularly for people who may not know SQL or maybe just generally unfamiliar with like a particular data set that you're getting.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's very, I guess, very cool way to kind of frame this, because you're coming from a position where you've dealt with this data, you know what the pain points for the end users are for querying this data, and I guess the level set here, SQL as language for communicating with databases for those not familiar, and I mean there's different pronunciation for it, but I think that's very interesting. That kind of you saw those pain points and you saw this new technology and you saw an opportunity there to solve that pain point with these tools combined together and new experience as well. So that's pretty neat. And so just kind of jumping straight into the cool part, where for today at least the demo and the tech part. And before we even get started with that, because your demo is really based on Streamlit, you have the Streamlit front end for that. And I'm just curious, when did you first find out about Streamlit, and what decisions kind of led you to decide to use it in your startup?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, in the hedge fund space in particular, the kind of preferred mechanism for receiving large amounts of data is typically Snowflake. Um, and Snowflake has essentially become kind of like the de facto standard for receiving large amounts of data. And I think Snowflake has done a good job, in particular with Snowflake Marketplace,
Yeah.
to be able to uh, like be a conduit for packaging and distributing data that end users can essentially bring in directly into their environment.
Yeah.
And so I was working a lot with Snowflake, the platform. And then when I saw that Snowflake had acquired Streamlit, that's when I had started looking into it. Um, and then, with Vanna, so the core of Vanna is an open source Python package. And so because it is effectively Python based, Streamlit is a natural add-on, because you can very quickly add a front end to the Python package components.
Oh, awesome. So yeah, so you found out Streamlit by proxy using Snowflake. So that's pretty cool to see how kind of. And I'm guessing you spent some time playing around with it, and you found you decided that okay, this is really cool. I like what I've been able to build with, and then incorporated it. Kind of felt seamless to incorporate it into your startup. And before we even kind of get to the demo, I see one question that kind of really I think is a perfect time to address now. As um, Caroline mentions that what's alternative data for us for those who are not familiar with, and from your definition, I think you did touch on it a bit, but maybe you can give a quick 30-second overview of what it is.
Yes, certainly. So, in order to define alternative data, you kind of need to know what traditional data is. So, in the finance space, traditional data is typically data like, company revenues, like various sales metrics, regional sales metrics. So, as an example, if you were to go to like the Apple website and go to their investor relations, you'll be able to see reports that they file, and there's a bunch of metrics in there.
Yep.
So that's kind of like your traditional data sets. Then alternative data sets is data that is not reported by the company, but there are ways of kind of figuring out proxies for how a company is potentially doing,
Yep.
based on what's kind of like what we generally think of as like exhaust data from other data sources. So an example could be like web scraping data. So you could, for example, get a sense of hiring trends if you were to scrape job openings for various companies, and then see which companies are hiring the most. That's just like one example.
Yep.
And then in credit card data, you can get a sense for like how many transactions are happening at particular merchants. And then get a sense for that over time. The key is that it's a lot more frequent than like the updates that you get on alternative data are a lot more frequent than you get from the companies directly. So companies typically will report quarterly, but alternative data you can get in many cases on a daily basis.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think that captures it pretty well. And yeah, there's so many companies that I've seen that deal with alternative data, and yeah, I think some interesting ones that I saw during COVID time was like some of this food traffic to the mall and things like that. But yeah, so kind of moving forward to the demo part. So I'm sure everybody's eager to kind of, I guess, see Vanna in action. So let's just jump straight into it. You can share your screen.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we're on the Streamlit podcast, I'm going to focus on like the Streamlit UI on top of Vanna. So as I mentioned, at the core, Vanna is like an open source Python package, and so we provide a bunch a bunch of underlying functionality that helps you generate SQL using large language models. And generally speaking, we're trying to be agnostic to which large language models you use, and then I'll get into it later, but also which vector databases you potentially use. So so this is a Streamlit interface. We have like a few configurable options, and I will click on all of them so that you can kind of get a sense for how this is going to function. But basically, using this, you're able to just ask questions to your database directly. So right now we are connected to like a demo database that I think it has data on, for example, like apparel sales. And so we could ask a question like, what are the top 10 customers by sales? And let's say include first and last name. So we ask that as a question, and that basically goes to the LLM, and we generate SQL from that question. So we asked, what are the top 10 customers by sales, include first and last name, and then the SQL is generated. And you can see, it included first name, last name, the total sales. It knows how to join things together. It does your group by. Then now once it's generated that SQL, it also runs it for you, so you get the results in a table. And then beyond that, we also provide additional functionality like generating, for example, Plotly code. So Plotly is another popular Python library that helps you generate charts. So generally speaking, you never have to see the underlying code for Plotly, which is why it's an option. But so this is an example of the Plotly code, and then this is an example of like the rendered Plotly graph. And as you know, one of the reasons to choose Plotly is because it has like good integration with a number of different front ends, and one of those front ends is Streamlit. So Streamlit, like has this kind of deep integration with Plotly, so this shows up really quite well in this
Yep.
interface. And then there's additional functionality like generating follow-up questions, and for example, you could so we asked about sales, and it's suggesting like let's say for example, how many orders does each customer have and whatnot. So that's a kind of like quick overall tour of like putting a Streamlit interface on top of Vanna. And so before I move on, I can address a couple of the questions that came in, I think. So I think we got a question on like, is it free open source? So yes. So the core Vanna Python package is open source, and if you go to GitHub Vanna AI /Vanna, you can find the source code there. The way that this works under the hood, so there's two main components. So you train a retrieval augmentation model, and you train it on your sort of like DDL statements, which is like just some metadata like about your database. You can give it documentation, And then you can also give it some reference SQL queries. Um, and then we generate embeddings and then store that into in a vector database. And then whenever you ask new questions, we're trying to find the most similar reference training data, and then that is sent to the LLM, which then returns SQL. And then once you have the SQL, then you can execute it, you can generate the charts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all downstream functionality. Um, so you can choose to host any of these components yourself. You can choose which vector database you want to use. You can choose which LLM you want to use. Uh, so those are just like components that are like easily implementable and swappable within the context of the Python package. We also provide some hosted solutions so that if you don't want to set up your own vector database and you don't have, for example, an OpenAI key, we can proxy those requests. So one of the things we found is like GPT 3.5 Turbo is very cheap for us to run. So if you're comfortable with that model, you can use that through us if you don't have an OpenAI API key. But if you do, you can use that, or you could plug into whichever LLM you want to use. Um, so I think other questions were around like, is it easy to integrate with AWS and Snowflake? Yes, absolutely. There's actually a number of ways that we've sort of prioritized Snowflake as one of the main databases that this integrates with. And we actually have a blog post on how you can use Vanna in particular with Snowflake inside the Snowflake UI itself. So now Snowflake has the ability to run Streamlit apps within the context of Snowflake, so that data essentially never leaves there.
Yeah. So this is a pretty good demo that you've given us here today. I mean, this is really interesting, just kind of to see the functionality first, the UI part of it, which I think it's really well implemented, and from even kind of choosing the output so you can be able to see what's actually like is what SQL is generated, what Plotly code looks like that's generating, to the point where you're getting the output that you're looking for. So I think that's a very streamlined view, and also more interesting. And I think most folks will probably be interested with it as well. It's kind of like the back end side of which you've touched a bit. You've shown us kind of like the architecture diagram of it, of what happens in the back. And just to reference a bit to your paper that was posted not so long ago as well, earlier this year, you mentioned that uh, the accuracy kind of ramped up from 3%, about 3% to 80% by focusing on context. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah,
And maybe some strategy as well.
absolutely. So we had done this paper a while ago on how accurately can LLMs generate SQL, in particular in the context of doing it for like real kind of databases. And so here we used a like an SEC filings database, and so it's an extremely complex data set to work with. And we show if you provide just the database schema to the LLMs, like the accuracy rates are really low. But if you provide a few example SQL queries, then your accuracy rates get a lot higher. And in particular, so in blue is one of Google's initial models, in orange is GPT 3.5, and in green is GPT 4. So from a few examples, we can see kind of that GPT 4 is one of the better ones at taking sparse examples and extrapolating them. But once you have a large corpus of reference SQL queries, even the less capable models are able to take those reference queries and rewrite them for like a new use case.
Awesome. So those are like very interesting strategies there, and I like that you kind of like battle tested some of those models to be able to kind of figure out where the kind of like the sweet spot was for generating this. And I think context is everything. And for example, I guess one thing you can touch on as well is how does kind of like the understanding of, because I know there's so many different within different organizations, there are like different lexicons for maybe, I don't know, like the schema, DDL, how they kind of structure things. What can you touch on in terms of like what's the full understanding, because of maybe some of these definitions?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So there's essentially three types of things that you can train the retrieval augmentation model on. So you train it on, the DDL statements. So the DDL statements are these create table statements, and what this tells the LLM effectively is that this table exists with these columns and these data types, and it may contain, for example, references like primary key and foreign key, which gives it some hints for how things join to one another. But I think in the context of like definitions, we have training on documentation, and documentation is essentially like any string that you give it as a reference. And so most commonly we see documentation used as providing like industry specific definitions, company specific definitions, because as we've seen, uh, like we were working with like a consumer packaged goods company that needed, when they referenced certain OTIF, certain like fields, and wanted specific calculations, they needed it defined in a particular way that the LLM did not have reference to. So like this company was delivering to Walmart, and were being evaluated by Walmart on essentially how on time some of their like their products were being delivered. And so you can provide that specific definition to the LLM by training on documentation.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool, because it kind of shows the importance of the more fine grained you can become, because at the end of the day, context is everything, right? So the more you can give it to it, it kind of makes your outputs more accurate, in a sense. Because I think from your paper as well, you noted that uh, GPT 3.5 kind of performed almost as similar as GPT 4, if with extra context, of course. So I think that was also another interesting take there. And I was just to switch gears a bit to kind of the entire pipeline, right? So a user enters a query, question, and then with all this schema, for example, documentation, and all this kind of coupled together. Once the SQL is generated, it also gets fed back into into like a vector database, right? And for for embedding and kind of indexing as well, so that next time, kind of, I guess, makes the models even better for next queries that will come. Can you touch a bit about kind of what's kind of like the strategies that went about in terms of choosing, first of all, I guess, Chroma DB, because I think that's kind of like the default one that you have on your docs and your GitHub repo, and how easy is it for users to kind of switch these providers around? Maybe they want to use a different vector database or a different LLM. How's that work with Vanna?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's like a couple of things that you touched on there. Um, so first, like Vanna has like a an abstract base class where we're essentially defining like, okay, these are the steps that are necessary to be able to generate SQL. And so for each of those steps, you can essentially swap out that step uh, with something that's either customized for your particular use case, or you can use one of the defaults that we provide. So I think one of the more common ways of using it locally is to use it with Chroma DB. And the reason for potentially using Chroma DB is that there's like no additional setup that's necessary. So to give everyone some context, ChromaDB is like a vector database that is essentially like encapsulated within SQLite. And so in the context of like a Jupyter notebook, you can run everything essentially in one process. Um, Now that's a pretty lightweight way of running it. I think like once you move into production, you'll typically want maybe a more production grade database, Postgres, PG Vector, Weaviate. I think somebody mentioned Pinecone. All those are potentially options. And then we also offer like our own hosted option as well.
as well. Okay, awesome. And with this, I know you've had some customers, and I know you've mentioned some of them already. And so, when you're getting feedback from them using Vanna, what are still kind of the main pain points that you're seeing or being reported by them, and how you kind of looking towards kind of maybe what are the missing links here, a bit.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that like accuracy rate is key. And so I think the way to think about this is that if you want AI to perform as well as like your in-house data analyst, you
Yes.
need to train it like an in-house data analyst.
Yes.
And so that means that you're providing that constant feedback and like a good amount of training. And part of that involves like being able to like document things well, because so we were working with this company, and they were asking questions like, oh, like what's our full funnel conversion rate? And they had top of the funnel visits that they were recording in certain columns, and the AI generated SQL statements that included those columns. But then they realized that after that was generated, that like, oh, actually, we don't use this column anymore because like 2 years ago, some process broke and like the data in there is garbage now.
Yeah.
So you really have to like document that well. And I think that's going to be like a challenge going forward, is that, like this information can't just live in the heads of like of people. Like the more that's documented, the more the AI is able to reference and generate things accurately.
Yeah.
um, I think an additional thing is in the context of Streamlit in particular, one of the things that's helpful is being able to bolt on additional processes. So we had the other day a recruitment company that was using Vanna, and what they're doing is, like if you're working with this recruitment company, they store your information in a database, and then when they have a company that wants to hire somebody, they'll ask like, oh, who are the candidates that speak, English and Italian and know, let's say Python and this other technology.
Yeah.
And so they'll ask these as questions, and then immediately afterwards, like, they'll have that list of candidates, and then they basically were able to just add a button right after that, and that button sent that list to their candidate management system to begin emailing those candidates that they had in their database, inviting them to apply.
Wow. That's a really nice use case there. That's very exciting to see some of those use cases in the wild. People kind of opening up new opportunities that kind of weren't available in the past. So that's really cool. And so I see that we have a lot of questions in the chat. So we'll just kind of transition towards the questions and kind of get some of these questions answered. And the first question here is from Shivika, and she has a question: is Vanna easy to integrate with AWS and Snowflake?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you go into our documentation, generally speaking, the default in the documentation is connecting to Snowflake. So connecting to Snowflake within the context of the Python package is super easy. It's just vn.connect to Snowflake, and then you give it your account, your username, your password, etc. And one thing to note is that the SQL is always executed in whatever environment you're running it. So uh, we do this generation in two steps. So uh, like we send metadata out to the LLM, SQL comes back, but then the SQL execution always happens wherever that Python code is running. So if you're running that Python code in the Jupyter notebook, and you're connecting it to your Snowflake database, that data always stays local in your environment.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's a very nice thing to call out there. it won't have any access to your data. It's just kind of sending these queries over and getting the data back to you. So that's really important to note. Another question here from Shivika as well. And what additional features does it have compared to developing own text to SQL assistance through LLM like AWS Bedrock, Google Vertex AI?
Yeah, so we are incorporating a lot of like base functionality, and some of that base functionality includes having that Streamlit app. So you know, we think about it in terms of like we have a number of different delivery mechanisms, and we're like really agnostic about what the delivery mechanism is. So we have the Streamlit app, we have a web app that you can host and run anywhere. We have like code for a Slack bot, and all of this is open source, so you can take it and you can essentially like uh, choose however you want to like plug it into various components and where you want to run it. And then additionally we have like hosted solutions for each of these, but the core of it is open source, and all of the delivery mechanisms are also like self-hostable.
Awesome. The power of open source. Awesome. The next question is from Emil, and his question is, how do you manage the speed of the LLM calls?
That's a good question. So um, we when we're finding like the most relevant like SQL statements and DDLs, so we're limiting like the number of tokens that we're sending. So we're trying to like optimize, so we'll only fill up the context window as much as necessary to be able to generate the SQL. So there are some defaults in the package which you can go in and override as necessary. um, but generally speaking, one of the things that we've found is that initially when you're using Vanna, we would recommend using it with some of the more capable models like GPT-4. More capable models will get you better extrapolation based on the training data that you currently have.
Yeah.
But as you add more, so whenever you ask a question and then that question returns like correct SQL, you add that back into the training set, and then it gets better over time. And as you have a larger and larger corpus of sort of known correct question to SQL pairs, then you can drop it down to one of the less capable models, like GPT 3.5 Turbo, and have extremely fast response times um, without sacrificing a ton of accuracy. So that's one of the strategies there.
Awesome. Yeah, that's some nice tricks there to implement as well. And the next question is from Eric, and he had asked a previous question, but kind of the same as this. Can users ask questions in context of business lexicon, i.e., how many ABCs did Eric buy last month?
Yeah, absolutely. So that that goes back to being able to train on documentation. So whatever that business lexicon is, just add that as individual statements of documentation. So if you have ABCs is has some specific definition, just you literally have to write that. ABC is defined as and then the definition.
Awesome. Yeah, these are really some nice tips coming out, and I think it's since it's open source, it's really nice for folks to just go out there and play with it and see what you can make with it as well. And we have a question here from a LinkedIn user. We don't have the name, but is there any metric on training cost to the size of the database?
Um, so I think one of the things to address here is that when we're talking about training, um, we're training a retrieval augmentation model, and so the retrieval augmentation model actually sits at a layer that is on top of the LLM. So the LLM isn't being trained. So and one of the reasons for doing this is actually addressing that, because there is no real cost to the training aspect of this. And the other nice thing of using retrieval augmentation as opposed to something like fine tuning is that at any point you can remove training data that you've determined was either incorrect and mistakenly put in there, or more commonly has become obsolete over time. So one of the things that we've seen is that your database is like a very like living thing that is connected to your business, and so things can happen in the business that affect what's going on in the database. And
Yes.
so you may have like processes that break, that no longer populate columns correctly, so you may want to remove those reference SQL queries because uh, you know they're not no longer relevant and correct. Maybe they were at one point, but they no longer are.
Yeah, that's a really nice thing to call out there, for sure. Because I think maybe in the beginning, because when I heard about it first, I think I had kind of the same intuition. Like, are we training the entire model, or are we just kind of so I can adapt on top of it? So I think that's a very good distinction there. And the next question is from Elena. And can Vanna extract window functions without training earlier one of these functions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have seen like really good results on, if you ask a question that requires a window function, nothing additional is really necessary um, for correct execution. I think the only like nuances that we've seen with like that are SQL specific are generally to do with date functions. So if you're asking like questions that are very specific to that flavor of SQL, sometimes it'll get it wrong. Like let's say you're asking a question about what are like how many users did we add in the last week.
Yep.
So in certain flavors of SQL, that'll be like you have to do like a date add. In others it'll be like add -7, like add interval -7 days, etc. And like some need quotations, some don't. So that's where having some reference SQL initially is helpful. And so generally speaking, it's not with the window functions that you need to give it some examples. It's usually with some of the date functions.
Awesome. Yeah, and this is that's a very important point, and I think also I think the other kind of raises another question in my mind. For auditability, because sometimes it will run, there's no problem, right? But then it could be misleading, maybe miss something. Like, how do you make sure that it's like there's observability throughout the process and it's actually generated the right thing? Do we need I guess, a human to kind of counter check some of these queries as well?
So that's a great question. So um, the core Python package essentially like has just the basic components for generating the SQL.
Yes.
In the hosted web app that we have, one of the things that we do is like, we actually segment business users from analysts, and then business users have the opportunity to say, something looks correct or may not look correct. And then the analyst, when they can review questions that people have asked, and then, either see what people have flagged as potentially incorrect, and then have the opportunity to correct that and maybe contact the original person who asked the question. So I think these are additional processes that probably need to be built up as into an organization. And I think that goes down well with like what's the future role
Yep.
of a data analyst. And I think as AI gets incorporated more and more, I think it's going to be less of taking in questions and like writing SQL and executing that SQL. It's going to be managing some of these business processes, managing like you know keeping an ear out on like what's going on with the business. How
Yes.
does that relate to the database, and how do I manage this model that is generating the SQL?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's a very good point. And one other question here from my teammate, my manager here, Caroline. Do you find that users have a lot of concerns about bringing an LLM into the mix when it comes to their data? And how do you ensure that the LLM doesn't have access to the actual data? I think we did touch upon this a bit, but you can elaborate more.
Yeah, so I think this is actually like a great question. It's a concern that comes up generally speaking for large enterprises.
Yeah.
So um, I think there is a certain comfort level that hasn't yet been achieved with LLMs, and I think a lot of people are concerned about data leakage. And so we've seen companies try to solve this in a couple of different ways. So one possibility is using Azure OpenAI.
Okay.
So we have seen some large enterprises use Azure's version of OpenAI because, in theory, whatever they send to that stays within their Azure environment. Um, so that's one thing. And then on our side, we, regardless of which LLM you plug into, we only ever send um, you know, DDL statements, documentation, and reference SQL. We never send the executed SQL to the LLM, and you can see that in the code in the package.
In fact, oh, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think security can never be overstated for sure, because that's kind of like the ongoing thing at the moment, and we don't want to lose data here. And another question from Caroline: do you have any customers fine tuning their own models on their own data rather than relying on only RAG?
Not yet, but that is certainly a possibility because you can theoretically plug it into any LLM. You could plug it into an LLM that has been fine tuned on your data, and then layer on this retrieval augmentation component.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I think for some, yeah, it's very interesting. I think I'm also yet to see somebody just kind of, I guess, build their own, I guess, took, I guess, the foundation models and train on their own data, and then kind of have that locally. I think it would be, I would think of it as it'd be a lot of overhead in terms of, I guess, the management part of it, and making sure it's kind of,
Yeah, the other thing with fine tuning is that it costs more. So
yeah,
like, there's a cost to fine tuning, and then running a fine tuned model also typically costs more than running like a standard version of a model. And so far, we haven't seen necessarily like a ton of benefit using a fine tuned model over just using the RAG. And I think, as we were talking a little bit earlier in our pre-show, uh, the speed at which things are changing and like foundational models are getting better and better. I think that's where like using RAG allows you to plug out of like one of the foundational models and plug into like the better one. And literally it seems like every single like week or every other week, like, we see evidence of foundational models getting better. Sometimes it's OpenAI, sometimes it's Mistral, sometimes it's Code Llama, and then maybe Gemini. So, as things are changing so rapidly, I think it probably makes sense to position yourself in a way that you can, plug into the best one or the most appropriate one for your use case.
for use case. Awesome. And last question here that we'll take from the audience. A LinkedIn user says, as the size of data increases, the LLM token limit prevents execution, especially with LangChain, SQL, Pandas agents. How does Vanna handle this scenario?
So, excellent question. So, by default in the Python package, when the token size exceeds a certain threshold, it'll switch to the larger context version of the model. So initially we had built it on GPT 3.5, and then it'll switch to the GPT 3.5 16K context. I think probably in the next couple of days we'll add more of like the GPT-4 switches. So now we have GPT-4 with like 128,000 context window. And I think we're trying to like put in some cost management in there and like only use the larger context model if it's actually necessary. Because as you know, like the larger context models typically have they're more expensive, can potentially be slightly slower, and with larger context, I think generally comes potentially like more inaccuracy as well.
Yes, yes, yes. I think I've seen that a lot with kind of missing some parts of the entire context window, and of course, there's been like some interesting strategies to kind of solve that, but I think it gets a little bit more complicated as it goes as well. So I think those are the main questions from the audience, and I have one probably burning question in everybody's mind right now is, with all those AI improvements, and now we have SQL, AI SQL agents. What does the future look like for data professionals and especially data analysts, analytics engineers, and that kind of field right there? What? How is it going to look like in the next kind of few years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that what we've generally started to see is that um, people like data teams in particular are looking for solutions to like the everyday grunt work of answering questions, ad hoc questions from business users. Um, and what this potentially allows them to do is it frees up time to work on more, for example, forecasting models and that sort of thing. So typically, what we've generally seen is that you know uh, business users. So in a large organization, business users will add to the data team's queue by adding Jira tickets, and
Okay.
so the Jira tickets will have like questions.
Yeah.
And now the problem is that if you answer a question, typically then the business user wants to dig in deeper. And so like answering a question will generate maybe 3 to 5 additional questions. And then that's 3 to 5 additional tickets. And so you essentially have this like weird cycle where this Jira backlog for data teams is just like exploding.
Yes.
It never gets smaller because as soon as you tackle one item that's on that backlog, it like expands immediately.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's one of the frustrations that we've seen with data teams and why they're like searching for solutions like this, because like this may not be the core of their job, and I think in the future we're going to see more of being able to use like let's say start incorporating time series models and that sort of thing, so more higher level tasks as opposed to just answering basic business questions.
Awesome. More automation. That's what I'm hearing. More automation. More time now to explore, I guess, high ticket value items or exploring other different new ways that we haven't even thought about. So I think that's a really great future from what I see. So they should be threatened in a way as well. Uh, Kind of leaning towards the end here. Usually, I ask this question for the guests. I personally consume a lot of data, more in terms of like new advancements in AI. My main go-to place has been Twitter or X, and Reddit, some Reddit forums as well. So for you, how do you keep up to date with AI news? I know like recently Google Gemini got released. Now we have Mixtral 8, 7 billion parameter, recently released by Mistral. So how do you keep up with all this? It feels like a chaotic space. How do you keep up with them, and how do you kind of implement? What's your process in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm probably following the same sources that you are. LinkedIn, X. There's a few. So there's a few writers that I like to follow in this space.
Yeah.
So I think in particular, as it relates to data analysis, I think Avi Chawla, who's pretty active on LinkedIn, and then generally there's another blog I follow called Ben's Bites. Uh,
Okay.
so that's another one where So I think that there are some people who are doing a good job of kind of seeing what's out there and curating that and digesting it.
Yes.
Um, and so I think that's probably more appropriate for like your general audience, but like given that I'm knee deep in it, I probably like refresh my X timeline like way too much.
Yeah. Wait. Yeah, absolutely. And talking about X, I recently subscribed to their premium service, and it comes with Grok, their LLM model as well on the timeline. And I found it really neat for those who have subscription already to it. I found it really neat. If you prompt it well, and this is where context comes in as well. If you prompt it really well, it will go ahead and kind of aggregate all the tweets. If you tell it maybe give me the recent news on AI for the past 2 days, it will kind of, I guess, time box those 2 days and give you the, I guess, quick spill down of like, hey, this is what it is, this is what happened. But at the same time, I feel like it's regurgitating maybe, people post on X, maybe quoting a certain article somewhere. You can always argue you can use ChatGPT to do the same thing with access to the internet. But yeah, different ways to absorb this data. So I think a lot of folks probably learn something from this and hopefully kind of add this to their toolkit of like, hey, this is how I can learn as well. And as a kind of closing, before we sign off here, kind of what's the next big thing for Vanna AI, and where can the audience go to get more information about? the cool stuff that you're building at Vanna.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on the screen is like the link to the GitHub. That's probably the best. If you're that deep into it. Um, so again, we have Streamlit package as well that is open source that you can take and fork as necessary. Um, we have like our website. We're on LinkedIn. So yeah, feel free to find us on any of these.
All right, awesome. And any new stuff that we should look forward to in the next few months?
Yeah, so I think that as some more of these models come out, we're going to begin integrating them and providing connectors to new LLMs. Like one of the ones that people have been talking about more recently is Mistral.
Yes.
I think we're going to begin doing some experimentation there, and we may potentially have like a fully locally runnable like version of Vanna where you have like the vector database running locally and like the LLM running completely locally. So that would essentially be like a no setup type of environment.
Awesome. A lot more experimentation is what I hear. So,
Yeah,
yeah. So, folks, please go to that link on the jumbotron below. Go to the website, learn more about Vanna, build some cool stuff, and feel free to share, tag them, or tag us as well. And just to close out as well, uh, this recording will also be on YouTube, and we have the link on the chat as well. So please go to our YouTube, and you can rewatch this, share with other folks that maybe missed it, that you think that they would want to listen to this and get something from this talk today. And please follow us on our socials at Streamlit everywhere, really, X and LinkedIn, and also YouTube for other future talks that we have in the pipeline that we think that you're really going to be interested in. And with that, thank you again, Zain, for joining us today. This was a really awesome, informative session, and I also hope the audience got some really good insights today from you. And yeah, with that, thank you again, and thank you to the audience, and see you on the next episode. Bye bye.
awesome. Thank you for having